agreeing to move your service to 1 o'clock instead of meeting at 10:30, which would have been 4:30 for me. I've never had any aspirations to preach at that hour of the morning. I was going to say ungodly hour, but I'm not sure if that's appropriate on a Sunday. But anyway, so thank you. Annette and I have really enjoyed the opportunity over the last little while to meet some of you and get to know you a little bit, to begin the stories, to hear some stories over Zoom. And I'm praying with you, as I'm sure you're praying, for God to lead us in this season. Yesterday, I was reviewing the football results. Sorry about the Wolves, Cameron. I feel your pain because I noticed that my team, Leeds United, lost too. And I found myself wondering if any of you will be rooting for Liverpool a little bit later today. Now, I'm guessing if you're a City supporter, maybe you wouldn't be too offended if Liverpool beat Man City. But my understanding was, as I was talking with somebody at the church, that said that the church is kind of divided between the red and the blue parts of Manchester City. I don't know. I don't know if that's true, but I just want you to know, I know a little bit about the red and blue divide. I know a little bit about that here, living here in the States, although I'm not sure it means quite the same thing that it means for you guys. But anyway, one of the things that we've been doing over these last days, however, has been, we've been seeking to get to know each other, haven't we? We're looking for to become acquainted through these Zoom meet and greets, the speed dating stuff that we've been going through. And my frustration, the only frustration I've had in all of this, well, one of the frustrations is that we just start a conversation and then it's over and we don't get to finish it. But together we're praying, aren't we, for God to guide our steps, to lead us forward. Because I think we intuitively understand that God knows what's best. And I think Scripture supports us in that. And this morning we heard the scriptures that were read and the stories that were told of God's leading and calling. We heard the call of God on Samuel and Philip and Nathaniel. I think it's unfortunate sometimes because when we think of God calling, we think of pastors and missionaries, as if God has no interest in calling anybody else. But it's not true, because God reaches out to each of us, regardless of our vocation or our age. He comes calling us. And as I was looking at the lectionary for this week, the readings for this week, I found myself kind of smiling, because here we are looking to know his leading and direction in our lives. And two of our texts are talking about call stories, right? However, as I was reading through the lectionary texts, I kept being drawn again and again to the words of David in Psalm 139. Interestingly, the reading from this psalm focuses on the first and the third stanza, or the first and the third paragraph of this psalm, not really reflecting on the others. And I think this morning that this is where I want us to focus our thinking for a few moments. There's a sense in which I think we want to do more than just hear these words. We want, in a sense, God to dig out our ears so that we can truly listen to what I think are some formative thoughts for us. As we look at these words, I want us also to keep in mind the background, the stories of Nathaniel and Philip and the story of Samuel. Because I love how God enters lives, don't you? In the story of Samuel, God shows up in Shiloh and calls Samuel. And this was seen as a significant event because we're told that the word of the Lord was rare in those days, which almost gives the sense, in some respects, that God had been absent, distant, even maybe aloof. I recall one of the texts, as I was thinking about that, from Advent, where we hear from the prophet, where he says, "Oh, that you would rend the heavens and come down." Yet as we hear in the psalm, it appears that for all the talk of God's absence, he's engaged in our lives, isn't he? David declares in this psalm that God is present. In fact, as you read the story of God again and again, you discover that what David proclaims is amplified, that God knows us. God is familiar. He's acquainted with all our ways. He knows when we sit and when we rise. And maybe he's not as distant as we sometimes presume. And we discover that certainly to be true in the story of Samuel. God has been watching over him all of his days. In fact, in 1 Samuel 2, before the story that we heard from Joseph, Samuel, we're told, that it says the boy Samuel grew up in the presence of the Lord. In the call of Nathanael, we see it too. I mean, did you catch how Jesus calls Nathanael a true Israelite? I don't know if you've ever thought about it this way, but I have this sense that Nathanael seems to be a little creeped out by this, because he says, how do you know me? It's almost like he's saying, are you stalking me on Facebook? And Jesus says, I saw you under the fig tree. And I think Jesus is saying more than he just saw him across the road and saw him under some fig tree. I think he's saying something deeper. I think he's making a declaration that God knows him, and maybe that's reflected in Nathanael's response. Anyway, as I was thinking about all this, another story from Scripture came to my mind as I was pondering these words of David, that he knows us. He knows when we sit and when we rise. It's the story of Hagar. She was a slave girl of Sarai. And the story goes that when Abraham and Sarai were struggling to trust God with a promise that he had made to them, that they would have a child, and they were getting frustrated waiting for this child to come, they took matters into their own hands, didn't they? And in a rather strange story, at least to us, at least to me, Sarah gives Hagar to Abram and says, well, she can bear a child for me. And well, the problem arises when it's discovered that she is indeed pregnant, that this plan is working, because it creates a rivalry between Sarai and Hagar that leads Hagar to run for her life. She flees into the wilderness. And yet, as she flees from her mistress, God hears her cry. God breaks in. He comes to this outcast, this outlier in the story of Genesis. And in fact, as he meets her, he speaks to her and he calls her by name. And if you were to go back to Genesis 16, where this story is found, you'll discover that this is the first time that anyone has uttered Hagar's name in the text, except other than the narrator. Up to this moment, when Sarai and Abram speak of her, they speak of her as a slave girl. And yet God calls her by name. He then calls her to name her soon-to-be-born son, Ishmael, doesn't she? Which means God hears. And then she does something that up to this point nobody else has done in the scriptures. She gives a name to God, and she says, he is the one who sees me. And here we have one who is fleeing for her life, and yet God comes to her. He meets this slave in her need. God, he knows her, he sees her, he hears her. And it's clear in the words that we read from the Psalm that David in this psalm is declaring these truths, that he is watching over us, that he's beside us, that he's behind us. Many of you may know that I was a missionary in Ireland with my wife, Annette, for a number of years. And in that role, one of the things that I remember doing was hearing again and again the story of St. Patrick. And as I read the words of this psalm, I couldn't help but remember some of the words from a prayer that he prayed, that he wrote, a prayer that speaks to God's presence, that he recognized all about him. In it, some of the words are Christ with me, Christ before me, Christ behind me, Christ in me, Christ beneath me, Christ above me, Christ on my right and Christ on my left, Christ when I lie down, Christ when I sit down, Christ when I arise, Christ in the heart of every man who thinks of me, Christ in the mouth of everyone who speaks of me, Christ in every eye that sees me, Christ in every ear that hears me. Those words, I think, really echo the scripture that's before us. And I wonder, do they bring us comfort? To know that God is with us? Maybe like Nathanael, we might wonder, well, how might God know me? Maybe with Samuel, wonder, well, how might I know and recognize his voice when I've never heard it before? With Hagar, we might wonder, well, how can I know that God is with me when everything around me is just falling apart, when my world is falling apart? I find myself wondering if David was pondering those same questions. I mean, let's face it, there were moments in his life, moments of darkness and difficulty. There are even echoes of it in the reality of this psalm, in the fourth paragraph that we're not going to look at this morning. And yet, as we read the words of this prayer, this hymn of David, we discover in his words a confidence, don't we, in the presence of God. He recognizes that God is all about him, that he's watching over him, that he's watching over us. Maybe the question is, well, why? What might lead God to take interest in me? Why should he care about Philip or Nathaniel or Samuel or especially Hagar? Why should he care about us? And this is where the third stanza of this psalm really helps us. These words are, well, we often use them when we speak of the sanctity of life, don't we? It says, I am fearfully and wonderfully made. It speaks of how God has formed us, how he's knitted us together. And I don't know about you, but I just love the imagery in this. I remember once watching someone work a potter's wheel. Have you ever done that? They work the clay with their hands. Maybe you've done it yourself, and forming it into some kind of object. They take this lump of clay, and using their hands, they form it and create this thing of beauty. There's an intimacy, though, isn't there, in that, between the potter and the clay. Hands have to touch and work the clay to mold it. You can't do it via Zoom. You can't do it without getting your hands dirty. In fact, the potter I watched wore an apron because it's a messy job. And here in our text, it's like David is putting God's hands intimately all over us, suggesting that he, like the potter, has formed us. That he got his hands dirty. I don't know about you, but that's amazing to me. The other image is that of knitting. I don't know if you've ever watched somebody who knits. Maybe you knit yourself. It's amazing to me how they can just carry on conversations all while those needles are just going on in concert with the yarn, the wool, whatever. And yet in some ways it almost appears mindless. And yet it's an activity that is intricate, purposeful, detailed, isn't it? When we were living in Ireland, Annette would go to the pub where they would meet. She would meet with a group of ladies and they would knit for what was affectionately called knit and natter. Or was it natter and knit? But anyway, she loved to knit. She would knit and she would talk, or was it talk and knit? And I remember a couple of times that she would return from the pub lamenting the light, which would lead her to have to pull out some of the knitting that she'd done. She'd point out this mistake and I'd be like, where? I don't see it. It seemed inconsequential, almost unrecognizable to me. But it was huge to her because she was following some pattern. It was like Greek to me, well, maybe worse, but it made no sense. But to her, she was following this design that over time would form this garment, this thing that reflected the pattern that she'd embraced. And in the text, we see God putting those knitting needles, don't we, into the hands of God. Not to poke us, but to remind us that we are intricately put together, designed. And the language, again, of the text is so intimate. It reveals the purpose of the Lord Almighty in our lives. My wife was working on some Christmas decorations. Here, see this? You can see this. She put hours into these different things that she would make. She's putting together. And as I look at them myself, I can see her fingerprints all over these wonderful things that she's created. And I think of the image that David paints, and I see the same thing suggested here, that God's fingerprints are all over his creation, over you and me. What he forms, what he knits together. It displays his creativity, his hand, his care. In a sense, we are his Stradivarius. All this reminds me of the words of Paul in his letter to the church in Corinth, which we're near the end of chapter 6. He says, you are not your own. You were bought at a price. In other words, we are incredibly valuable. And I think we could do to remember that, couldn't we? I have these two plates with me this morning. This one here, I don't know if you can see it. It's a Wedgwood plate. It's a plate that is a part of a set that was my mom and dad's. When my mom passed away, my dad gave it to Annette and I, and it's precious to us. We bring it out at special occasions, Christmas, Thanksgiving here in the States. And it sits around the table, and it reminds me of my mom. It reminds us of our family. It's Wedgwood, it's wild strawberry. It's part of something that's precious to us. This other plate is a paper plate. You know what we do when we're done with this? We bin it. We throw it away. It has little value. And I really think that David is suggesting that you and I are more like Wedgwood than paper. He suggests that we are valuable to him. But this is about more than just about you and me. It's also a word about others, because we're all precious. The ones that you see when you look in the mirror, the ones that you see on our Zoom call, that we're worship service that we're doing together, the ones that you see sitting across the table from you, or on the streets of Ashton, or here in the street on the streets of the Woodlands, even those that are hidden from our view in places like Ethiopia and Bangladesh. And I find myself wondering, why do we sometimes treat people like Wedgwood and other times like paper? In many ways, Abraham and Sarai, they treat Hagar like a paper plate, a throwaway, not Wedgwood. She was their slave girl. And yet, as she fled for her life, she found herself out there, not alone and abandoned. She found and discovered that God saw her and heard her. He called her by name. She was precious. In our Old Testament reading, we heard God call not once, but 4 times for Samuel. He didn't give up on Samuel after calling twice or even 3 times, because Samuel was precious to God. As we close, I find myself going to the end of this psalm. You see, at the end, we find a petition, which is, well, it's kind of interesting because of how the psalm begins. David, in a sense, at the end of this psalm, invites God to do what he has already done. For the one who is searched is called to do it again. Maybe he knew our propensity to not allow his words to change us, to move us in a new direction. And so he prays this prayer: search me, O God, and know my heart. Test me and know my thoughts. See if there is any wicked way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting. I find myself wondering, would we be brave enough to pray this prayer? Especially in light of the words that we pondered this morning, words that remind us that we are precious, for God knows us. He formed us. He knitted us together. But not just for we who gather together, but for our neighbors, for our world, for those ravaged by war, for those who find themselves struggling to find a warm meal or a bed. You see, it's not just David and Samuel who are precious to God. It's even a slave girl named Hagar. It's you and me. I wonder, are there people I'm prone to treat more like paper than Wedgwood? Are there people I'm more inclined to dismiss instead of treating as precious? I wonder. Maybe we need to join with Samuel in saying, "Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening." Joseph, would you lead us in a song?